You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Welcome to the CNA Correspondent podcast. I'm Teresa Tang. Ever since Donald Trump returned to the White House, his team has been trying something different. Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt hops on social media with something called the MAGA Minute. It comes straight from the White House, and it's a roundup of what the administration describes as its top wins of the week. This is what they put out earlier this month.
On the border, President Trump declared a national emergency, deployed the military, ended catch and release, and reinstated Remain in Mexico. And already, illegal crossings are down 95%. We are resuming construction of the border wall in Colombia.
Immigration is often the top win of the week in these reels. It is, after all, a hot topic among the American public. It dominated Mr. Trump's presidential campaign and now dominates headlines.
Last week, more than 100 Indians were deported from the US, accused of entering the country illegally, and there are hundreds more citizens who are due to be sent back soon. New Delhi.
This week on the podcast, we're talking about what Donald Trump's policies mean for ordinary people and where, or if, immigrants fit in with the U.S. president's version of America. Toni Waterman joins us from Austin, Texas, and Neha Poonia is with us from New Delhi in India. Toni, Neha, even though we're in different time zones, it couldn't keep us apart. Thanks so much for coming on today.
It's great to be here.
Thanks for having us, Teresa.
Toni, I want to start with you. Donald Trump campaigned really hard on the immigration issue. He promised to expel the largest number of undocumented migrants in American history, and he got right to work right after he was inaugurated. About 11 million people are believed to be living in the U.S. without proper documentation. Now, you are based in Texas, and for people who may be listening who may have never been to the States, how obvious are these undocumented migrants? How often do you come across them?
Well, maybe I can start with just a little bit of a scene setter. So there are 4 states that share this border with Mexico, but Texas shares the largest land border. We're talking more than 2,000 kilometers. So the vast majority of these migrants that are crossing into the U.S., they tend to be doing so in Texas. And there is a very, very large migrant community here, undocumented community here, somewhere around 1.7 million individuals. So that is about 1 in 20 people that live in the States. So they are very much a part of our community. I'm not sure that you could definitively, kind of pick them out in a crowd, partly because there is already this very large legal Hispanic and Latino population in Texas, people that have lived here for generations and generations, and they are in fact the largest ethnic group in the state. Texas is also a largely anti-immigration state. So the governor here, the Republican governor, has been very aggressive in this immigration crackdown, even long before Trump came into office. So people who are in the state illegally, they're not exactly advertising it. That being said, there are these certain sort of telltale signs. So sometimes you'll see these groups of mostly men gathering in the very early morning hours at gas stations or in car parks. And these are day workers. These are people that are there looking for a job. They are mostly undocumented. I tend to do a fair amount of shopping at Spanish markets, and oftentimes you'll run into employees that don't speak any English. That doesn't mean that they're here undocumented, but it is this indication that there are a lot of people who are not from the United States living here in Texas. San Antonio, which is about an hour's drive from here in Austin, but a 2-hour drive from the border. This is this very large migrant transit hub here in Texas, where you have migrants either coming in the back of lorries as part of human smuggling networks, or they're brought here on buses that the state government is providing, and then they're using the city as a connector either to other parts of the state or, more often than not, to other parts of the U.S.
What is the impact that illegal immigrants have on America, on the economy, on society, that has President Trump so determined to root them out?
I mean, there are a lot of things that Trump says migrants are doing, that these threats that they pose, a lot of that is just simply not true. And he does have this very, very long history of using degrading language towards immigrants. So he's called them rapists and murderers, mentally insane individuals. He says that migrants are eating people's pets. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And this is kind of spread across the United States. But the central theme for the Trump administration, and certainly something that we saw during his reelection campaign, was this idea that illegal migrants are very dangerous individuals, that these governments are sending the worst of the worst individuals to the United States, and that these illegal or undocumented individuals, that they are responsible for this crime spree across the U.S. And there have been these really horrendous crimes that undocumented people have committed. This includes a trial that's taking place right now in Texas, where 2 undocumented Venezuelan men have been charged in the rape and murder of a 12-year-old girl. So nobody's denying that some of these individuals are carrying out these really horrible crimes, but extensive research, decades and decades of research, has actually shown that immigrants, both legal and illegal, commit fewer crimes, including violent crimes, than native-born Americans. Trump and his conservatives also believe that immigrants, the vast majority of whom are these low-skilled workers, that they are stealing jobs from Americans, particularly from Black and Hispanic Americans. Again, the data doesn't really back that up, but these themes have really been absorbed by the American public. And then you had these images of thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people crossing the border on a daily basis during the height of the immigration crisis. And you had people, even very liberal-minded folks, take a step back and say, wait a minute, we need to look at this issue. We need to be knowing who is coming into the United States. Trump has wasted absolutely no time in trying to implement this immigration crackdown. Within days of taking office, he declared a national emergency. This freed up funds and personnel to help with this crackdown. He sent thousands of troops to the border. We're expecting upwards of 10,000 eventually to be there. Here in Texas, soldiers are now allowed to make arrests, to detain people, to help with deportation, something that they've never really done before. So there is a lot that Donald Trump is doing to address these concerns, whether they are valid or not. I think the real question is going to be how much Americans can stomach. What will be the breaking point for people?
Neha, one source of undocumented migrants that head to America is India, right? You filed a story about how so many people there are just lured by the American dream. They believe it really is a land of opportunity, and they're willing to do anything to get there. Can you tell us more about the people you spoke with?
Absolutely. And, this is something that has been perpetuated, this idea that America is the solution to everyone's economic problems through years of representation in popular culture. And Bollywood, which is the Indian film industry, has a big role to play because, most big budget films will have someone traveling to the US, miraculously finding a well-paying job, and then they can send money back home. And there's this idea that, it's a romantic life that's waiting for them thousands of miles away. And, what Toni's painting, it's the exact contrast here in India. It's the people from villages mostly that are traveling, oftentimes risking everything, risking their lives, entire savings to make this dangerous journey. And there has been a trend. The number of Indians who are now traveling to the US as undocumented migrants has grown, particularly in the aftermath of COVID, where we saw a devastating second wave impact the economy and exacerbate what has been a terrible unemployment crisis. And the numbers they vary. So there's one report that puts the number of undocumented Indian migrants living in the US at 725,000. There are others that say there are about 300,000. Official data from the US says there are about 220,000 unauthorized Indians as of 2022. But their numbers are growing. They're now the third largest group. And we traveled to a village which it's an incredible scene that you'll see there, because I've never been to an Indian village that is so quiet, that's so deserted. And that's simply because nearly everyone who's a working age has, traveled to the US, and a majority of them have traveled as undocumented migrants. And we spoke to one family there, this middle-aged man called Gurudev Singh, who sent his 18-year-old son to the US. And, we found him after knocking on several doors. There is this idea that, the American dream is what every family in this village, this very small village, wants to pursue, but no one wants to talk about it because they're also aware of the kind of headlines Trump has been making, talking about, sending undocumented Indians back, his meeting with Modi. So everyone's aware of this narrative. So they don't want to speak on camera. But Gurudev, I found him so brave and so honest. He admitted that his son traveled illegally. This was 2 years ago. He's now working somewhere along the West Coast. He didn't want to share too many details because he was worried that, should the story come out and it will be published online, he may be putting his son's life at risk. But, he's from a relatively well-to-do family compared to many other villagers I spoke to. He owns acres of land, which in India would mean that he is at the higher end of the pecking order when it comes to, village social life. He has tons of money. He was building a new house when I met him, some of it funded by the money his son is sending back from the US. And, just the way he spoke about this desire that his son had to get to America at any cost, it tells you how this is not just a vague concept for a lot of Indians. It's something that people are risking everything for. And he told me he's worried that, it could be his son who's sent back in the next few months. And he said if that happens, his son's American dream will be shattered.
So you managed to get Gurudev to speak to you on camera, but the fear that you mentioned, right? There are others who are very reluctant. Why were they so afraid?
I think part of it is that they know that this is not the legal route, right? They know that their sons, their daughters have gone to America through an illegal route, and they don't want to necessarily be very open about admitting that. They will talk to you about that behind closed doors. I mean, we got there in the early hours of the morning and we had hoped that we'd find someone to talk to in a few hours. It took us the entire day. We went from house to house asking people, could they tell us their story? A lot of them did speak to us, but off camera. They were all saying that, my son's gone to the US. He's paid this travel agent who then put him in touch with human traffickers, who then sent him on this crazy route called the donkey route or the donkey route to the US. And, they're paying sometimes as much as $50,000 US. And that's incredible amounts of money for people who are barely making enough to get by. So you can imagine how they're raising that money. And, this reluctance just came through in every conversation we had. Parents who are scared that their kids might be targeted, might be identified, might be sent back. It might jeopardize the chance of another kid from the same village as well. And, this fear was what stood out among all of these voices, which is why Gurudev's story was remarkable. The fact that he could speak to us on camera was also because his son has recently gotten a work permit, so he's not that worried, but he's also afraid that having gotten to the US through this illegal route, you never know what happens with the Trump administration, and that's what they're constantly worried about. And this is what he told me when I asked him what his thoughts are about what could happen to his 20-year-old son.
I'm terrified. I don't know what Trump will do to our kids. Our son is safe for now, but I'm constantly worried. If he ever gets expelled, our family will be ruined. We spent tens of thousands of dollars to send him there so he can earn well. God forbid, if he's targeted by authorities, then apart from the trauma of being deported, he'll also lose his lifelong dream of being in the US.
And this fear, Teresa, was, pretty much the main theme of the conversation. His wife didn't speak to us on camera, but I did catch her talking to her son. And it's like any conversation between a mother and a son. She's worried, is he eating on time? Has he got friends he can talk to? Is he getting out? But they're also worried that, he's working at a grocery store, much like many of the migrants that Toni was describing. And they're worried that, a raid could happen while he's at work, while he's at home. So he's keeping to himself. He's constantly living under the threat of some sort of action. And that fear and anxiety has traveled all the way back here in India as well.
So much at stake for these families. And Toni, let's keep on that point of the fear. It's such a common thread in these stories of immigration, the fear of the journey, fear of being able to stay in America, of getting caught, getting sent back. And there have been raids in cities across the United States. The Trump administration says their focus is hardened criminals. Is that what is happening on the ground?
Yes and no. I mean, Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, says that immigration agents are working from a list of known criminals. And certainly we have seen in the last couple of weeks them rounding up some very not good people, people that have been charged with rape, with murder, who are members of these very violent gangs. So they are doing this. But to put it into context, every single administration does this. So this is nothing new. They always go after the bad guys and try to get them out of the country. I mean, what we're seeing that's very different with the Trump administration is that they are being very intentionally public about it, whereas the Democratic leaders of the past have kind of done this in the shadows because it wasn't a popular thing to do. In the first couple of weeks, they were arresting somewhere between 800 and 1,200 individuals a day, which is actually less than the Biden administration was doing. If they kept on this track, they would only be deporting about half of the number of people that the Biden administration deported in the last full fiscal year. But on some days, about half of the people that they were arresting were individuals that have absolutely no criminal record. Their only crime is being in the U.S. without proper documentation, which of course is a crime, but it's not exactly equivalent to, murderers running around on the streets. But they are being caught up in these raids, as Neha was saying, and this is something that they are incredibly fearful about, especially now that the Trump administration is allowing these immigration agents to go into schools, to go into churches, to go into hospitals, to find these individuals. And these are places that for decades have been considered safe spaces. This is where immigration officers never went into, and now they are. So this is creating a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety within the immigrant community that there really is no safe space for them. And I've been speaking to a lot of them. They're telling me that they are laying low, that they are only going out when it is absolutely necessary for them to do so, and that some of them aren't going to work anymore. Some of them aren't sending their children to school anymore because there is just this present and constant fear in their lives. They're afraid of being swept up in this crackdown. And I actually spoke to one woman that has kind of experienced this firsthand. Her name is Ashley. She lives out in Lubbock, Texas, which is in the western part of the state. She is American. Her 3 children are American, but their father and her husband, Jose, he is an undocumented migrant. And just 2 days after Trump was inaugurated, they were on their way to a local Walmart. They needed diapers. They needed formula for their 6-month-old son. They missed their turn and they were then pulled over for a traffic violation, and Jose was arrested.
He goes, "Oh, I did miss my turn." Then he looks behind him and he was like, "There's a cop behind us." And my heart sunk down to my stomach. I say about 10 immigration agents. They all flooded out of the car. It was like a scene from a movie.
What's going through your mind at this point?
Terrified.
Because of this arrest and now Jose being in the system, he is facing deportation. I actually spoke to their lawyer and she said that he has no criminal background, that he was actually in the process of receiving a green card, which would give him legal status and permanent residency in the United States. This is all now in jeopardy and he could be deported. And Ashley told me that because of this climate and this atmosphere around immigration right now, a lot of it kind of ginned up by Trump on the campaign trail, and now these actions that are taking place with these raids and this crackdown, that she really thinks that her husband is going to be deported. And she told me that if that does happen, that she is going to leave the United States. She's going to take herself and her children to Honduras so that the family isn't separated. So it's pretty remarkable when you think about it that the only option potentially for this American is to actually leave the country to ensure that her family isn't separated.
Neha, unfortunately, there are people out there who are benefiting financially from the desperation of these people. Their business is taking individuals through incredibly dangerous routes to get to America.
That's absolutely right. I refer to this because this is essentially what we found in a majority of the cases when it comes to Indians traveling to the US. And the reason why people are so desperate to get to the US illegally is because a lot of the times they don't make the cut for legal requirements. So they either don't have the educational qualifications, they don't have the requisite English level speaking skills, so they can't apply for formal jobs in the US, which is why they then turn to what is called the donkey or the donkey route colloquially. There was even a Bollywood film made about it a few years ago where the main character travels to the US like this, and there was a lot of dance and drama and romance. Once again, speaking to the kind of romanticization that happens of these often dangerous, life-threatening conditions and the desperation that this stems from. There are travel agents, Teresa, who exist in large parts of the country, a lot of them flying under the radar. They are taking as much as $50,000, sometimes even more, from Indians who want to get to the US. What they then do is they put them on a legal flight to a destination like Dubai or Italy, and then they hand them over to smugglers. Now, these smugglers will then, sometimes put them on those crowded boats that often capsize off the coast of Europe. Then from there, they're taken, via land routes to Spain. And then from Spain, they're flown to Brazil, taken in containers that are often carrying products like meat. And then they are then forced to trek the Darien Gap. And this is what one of the people I spoke to, Mandeep, who is a 28-year-old guy, he took this perilous journey 2 years ago. It took him more than 6 months. And he told me he can't believe now that he made it back in one piece. And he's someone who's got a college graduation. He is someone who could potentially work in India, find work in one of the major cities here. Just listen to the cost of the journey that he endured and how he described what those final moments getting to the Mexico-US border felt like to him.
I could see the end of my life. It felt like we were walking towards our death. We were treated like dogs, beaten and abused. An elderly man who was on the journey with us was beaten so badly, his head split open when he got tired and stopped walking.
This entire journey, it's left him broken. He's still paying tens of thousands of dollars to just physically recover. He was beaten. His nails were pulled out by the human smugglers. He says at so many moments he thought he wouldn't survive, but yet he wants to go back. He's going to attempt another crossing. He said sometimes in the next few months. This time he says he may go from Canada because he's been banned by the Mexican government. He was deported from there, so he can't enter Mexico for the next 5 years. And that, I think, sums up the desperation perfectly. It doesn't matter, he said, what the cost of the journey is. All that matters is getting into the US and having a shot at living that American dream.
I'm just going to jump in on that thought really quickly about the dangers of the journey, because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of migrants that leave from their respective locations that never actually make it to the United States. And there is a big fear among these NGOs in the United States that try to aid these migrants along the routes. Some of them go out into the desert and leave water and leave food for these people. Don't forget, when you're crossing into Texas, from Mexico into Texas, it is extremely, extremely hot in those summer months. We're talking 45 degrees Celsius every single day in the desert for days at a time. And there is real concern amongst people in the aid community that these measures that the Trump administration is taking, like shutting down an app, a phone app that these migrants were using to legally get into the United States, that this is now going to encourage people to take even more dangerous routes, to use people smugglers, human smugglers, even more, because as Neha was saying, there is this desperation just to get here at any cost.
The Trump administration has been flying migrants back to their home country, sometimes to third countries as well. And the latest immigration numbers show that apprehensions along the U.S. southern border fell 85% last month. And Toni, you spent a lot of time in Eagle Pass, Texas, right along the U.S.-Mexico border in recent weeks. What is it like there right now?
Quiet. extraordinarily quiet, and it's actually been like that for a fairly long time. Migrant crossings really started to plummet last June. This is when the former president, Joe Biden, introduced these new policies that made it more difficult for asylum seekers to come to the United States and also easier for border officials to deport them. And at the same time, Mexican officials really stepped up their patrol. So they were sending out law enforcement that has been breaking up these migrant caravans long before they can even reach the U.S. southern border. So when Trump was actually inaugurated last month, migrant crossings were lower than when he had left office. So this is a trend that actually started a couple of months ago. And of course, these policies that we talked about that he has reinstated and put into place that has pushed these numbers down even further. He's done other things. He's now making these migrants stay in Mexico while their cases are being heard. When I was in Eagle Pass just a couple of weeks ago, I wanted to go and visit this migrant shelter that I always go to every single time I'm there. It is the only migrants shelter and processing center. And it was no longer a migrant center. They had converted it into a homeless shelter because there just aren't any migrants to help right now. And when I had visited this shelter during the height of the immigration crisis, they were processing 1,000 people a day. One other thing I'll say about what has happened in Eagle Pass in the last year or so is that it has become a militarized zone. The National Guard has taken over this public park. Nobody can access it unless you have permission. There are armed soldiers that are standing at the border with Mexico, in theory, apprehending anybody that would be coming across. And there are kilometers and kilometers of meters deep barbed wire that you can't even move through. And a lot of people are in the mindset that this is what is going to just be replicated down the entire stretch of the U.S.-Mexico border.
Neha, there were reports of some Indians who were deported from America. They had their arms, their legs shackled during their flight home. Can you tell me what the Indian government's reaction to those expulsions has been? And how much of a political challenge is it going to be for Prime Minister Narendra Modi to deal with Mr. Trump in the months and the years ahead?
Well, experts have been speaking to former ambassadors say that this is perhaps going to be the most defining feature of the US-India relationship, which is why you've seen the sort of reaction from New Delhi in the last few weeks. We've seen 300 plus illegal Indians who've been deported and expelled from the US, all of them landing in the northern Indian city of Amritsar in the state of Punjab on 3 military flights. And there's been a lot of uproar, especially from the opposition, about the conditions under which they were returned. I mean, this is not unique. Like Toni's been saying, this has been happening for years now. Last year as well, there were about 100 Indians who were deported before Biden left the office. But I think it's the show and tell nature of this expulsion drive with, the US government, the border police tweeting videos of these Indians who are shackled, who've not been allowed to get up from their seats on a 40-hour flight. Some Indians saying that, their turbans were also removed, which is, of course, something that sparked a row over disrespect to religious customs. The opposition is accusing the government of not raising what it's calling, an insult to regular Indians, given the manner in which they have been deported. And they're saying that in the past as well, other governments have raised this with, US administrations, but they're accusing Modi of particularly turning a blind eye. And we saw this when Prime Minister Modi traveled to the US. He met with President Trump, and the focus very much from the Indian administration has been that, illegal migration is bad. It's not good for any country, and it's every country's responsibility to take its illegals back. But India doesn't want this illegal migration controversy to also impact legal migration of millions of Indians. Now, Indians make up the largest group that receives H-1B visas, which are visas for skilled workers who work in Silicon Valley, who work as engineers in, the big tech firms in the US. And that's very much its focus. It wants to ensure that legal migration route is not curtailed signaled by Trump, which did happen when President Trump was last in power. He had cut down on the number of H-1B applications and visas that were being issued to Indians. So that's the cost that India is weighing up. And the opposition says, well, that's fine. You still also need to protest the manner in which Indians are being sent back. But, my sense is that that's not something that Prime Minister Modi is going to raise with the US, because India understands it's on the back foot here, given that there has been an increase in the number of Indians who are making this illegal journey to the US.
And on that point of legal pathways, Toni, before we go, you reported on that dimension to this story. Immigrants in America legally are now growing increasingly nervous that their status could change at any moment, right? What are their concerns exactly?
Well, we've actually seen some of these groups already be targeted. So 350,000 Venezuelans are losing their protected status. This is a temporary immigration protection that they had been granted under the Biden administration, which has allowed them to live and work in the U.S. while their cases are being processed. And the Biden administration had deemed it too dangerous for these individuals to go back to their home countries. But this privilege, this protection is now being stripped away from them. The Trump administration has also halted refugee resettlement programs. So 200,000 people could be impacted by that. And that includes Afghans that worked alongside the United States in fighting the Taliban during that decades-long war. And so people who are in the U.S. legally with permission to be here and to work here, they are getting very, very nervous. I spoke to a lawyer here in Austin that works with a lot of Asian people, Asian nationals that either are in the U.S. working already or they're overseas waiting for their work visas to be approved. And he said there is just a heightened sense of anxiety right now. He really thinks that Trump is going to reinstate this extreme vetting policy, which would prolong the visa process, adding to what is an existing backlog of 1.2 million applications. And also, it's going to leave the roughly 880,000 Asian nationals residing in the U.S. on U.S. temporary work visas in this constant state of limbo. And there are a lot of people in the Trump orbit right now that are saying that all immigration should be halted. And that includes for student visas and those H-1B visas that Neha was just talking about. And nearly all of the recipients, as she was saying, for that H-1B visa, for the high-skilled work visa, they come from Asia. So people are very scared that going after undocumented immigrants is really just the first step for the Trump administration.
Well, we are only in the second month of this second Trump presidency, and one thing's for sure, a lot more could happen, probably will happen on the immigration front. Thank you both so much for following this story.
Thanks so much, Teresa. I think it's really important to platform these stories.
Yeah, I agree. It's just such a big issue, not just here in the U.S., but really across the world.
And a reminder, you can find Neha and Toni's reports on YouTube as well as on CNA.Asia. And there are also TV episodes of CNA Correspondent every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. I'm Teresa Tang. The team behind this week's episode is Saya Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, and Craig Dale. A new episode drops next Wednesday. Join us then. Bye for now.